Well, it's good to see everybody back this evening. We're glad that you are here. Something I didn't have time to mention this morning that I want to take a minute to talk about tonight. You may have noticed in the update that we're asking men who would be interested in doing Wednesday night devotionals to sign a sheet on the bulletin board in the hallway over here to my left. We are putting together a little class for that. If you sign that up, you don't have to go to the class, but we are going to have a little class, and we're going to be helping those who want to develop that ability and those who want to continue using that ability. And that would be very useful to you, whether you want to do a Wednesday night devotional here, or if you're one of those that help us with the Lord's Supper, that would be another way that it would be helpful. And so any age, you can be young or old. We want our boys doing speech and Lads to Leaders to be involved in this as well. But you don't have to be involved in Lads to Leaders to take advantage of it as a young person. So just read over the update announcement again if you're confused about this, and if you're interested, sign the sheet in the bulletin board. If you have any questions, just ask, and we'll see if we can answer them. We're continuing our series tonight on daily Christianity, and tonight's subject is daily reliance. I want to start with this question to get you thinking. What does Jesus saying in Matthew 22:21, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, what does his saying in that passage have to do with the model prayer? Jesus stated both those things. There's something those two statements have in common, and they relate to this evening's lesson. Whenever Jesus was being trapped by the Pharisees with this controversy about taxes, they asked him if it was right to pay taxes to Caesar. He asked to see a coin. And when they produced it, he said, "Whose inscription is on the coin?" They said, "Caesar's." And that's when he gave the answer, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And there's a couple things that we can pull from that. One thing is that these things have lanes. They can be kept separate. There are categories. There are certain things that are under the world's control, and there are certain things that are under God's control. And the other thing you can take from that is the things of God take priority over all other things. But what does that have to do with the model prayer? Well, you turn to the model prayer in Matthew chapter 6, and Jesus shows this same sorting out of responsibilities, and he says this should be a part of our prayer lives. You see him turning over to God things beyond our control. If you go through it, you can make a little list. His will in heaven and on earth. That's God's things. Our daily bread. That's God's. Forgiveness. That's God's to give. Temptation. Not in the sense that God is tempting us, but when we pray, "Lead us not in temptation," we're asking God to keep us out of circumstances beyond our control. God in His providence may intervene on our behalf. And so you see this sorting out of responsibilities, and the prayer is an exercise in yielding to God the things that are God's. Of course, we have responsibilities too. In the prayer, he says, we should pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." And later on in verses 14 and 15, he says that our forgiveness is contingent on whether we are willing to forgive others. So we have responsibilities, but my point is the saying about Caesar and the model prayer has this in common. In the model prayer, you see an example of reliance on God to take care of the things that are God's. You you see this idea that there are certain things God can do, and then there are things that we can do. This reliance that Jesus is teaching us in the model prayer is a daily reliance. He says, "Give us this day our daily bread." And I think that's instructive for us because we tend to focus on relying God in the big moments in life. We think about big decisions, where to go to college, who to marry, where to live, what job I should take. This is when we start asking, what is God's will for this? But Jesus is teaching us that really the reliance should occur on a micro level, on a daily basis. We should always be asking God for assistance, relying on Him in the ordinary and in the extraordinary. Oswald Chambers says this, and I think this is a good statement. The test of a man's religious life and character is not in what he does in the exceptional moments of life, but what he does in the ordinary times when there is nothing tremendous or exciting on. And that's what Jesus is saying in a nutshell when He teaches us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Rely on God every single day. Don't just look to Him for guidance in the big moments, but in the small moments as well. And so this requires a proper daily focus. To rely on Him this way, we must focus every day on this. And so we're going to look at that this evening as we see what we're to focus on. We're going to see, first of all, we should focus on what we can do. Secondly, when we can do it. Thirdly, why we should be doing it. And finally, we'll see that we should let God handle the rest. So first of all, let's get our focus on what you can do. And we're in Matthew chapter 6. And we're looking at the model prayer. But I want you to notice after the request for daily bread is taught in the model prayer, a few verses later, Jesus is talking about anxiety. And in verse 25, He tells us what He means by daily bread in more detail. Look at what He says. "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing?" So when He says we should pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," He's not just talking about bread. I think some people look at it and they say, well, it's not just bread, it's also every kind of food. So bread and meat and milk and everything. But it goes beyond that as well. When you get over to verse 25, you see other categories that should be included as well. He's looking at this in terms of what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will put on your body. What He's talking about here are the provisions that we need to live our lives. And He's saying you have very little control over them. And if you think about it, what really can you do about making sure you have food on your table? There's a little that you can do, but you rely on a lot of other things to happen in a chain reaction that starts with God in order to have bread on your table. And later on in Matthew 6, verse 27, Jesus asks this question. He says, "Which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life?" New King James Version says, "Which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature?" Can you overpower your lifespan? Can you overpower your height? Can you make yourself taller by force of will, by worrying about it? Of course not. Earlier, Jesus said this in Matthew 5:36. "Do not take an oath by your head. You cannot make one hair white or black." In other words, there's only a little that you can do. And that's what you should focus on. And the rest of it you should render to God. Those things are in His control. Now, I think we need to be careful and understand what He's not saying here before we move on. When He says focus on what you can do, on the things under your control, number one, He's not saying we have no responsibilities at all. He uses a couple of examples in Matthew 6, verses 25 and following. The birds and the wildflowers. Now let's take a look at that for a minute. He says in verse 26 that food, daily provisions, come to the birds without toil. He says, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Now that's a good point. Do the birds do nothing at all? They have to do something, right, to gather their food to eat. You know, it's amazing to watch a mother bird go and gather food to bring back to the nest to feed the baby birds. That's a really amazing thing to watch. Those of you who have bird feeders, you see how hard those birds work, sometimes competing with one another to get the seed, sometimes fighting with squirrels and other things to get the seed. You see all of that. So God doesn't drop it into their mouths, but He makes it accessible to them so that the least of them, the weakest among them, is able to have access to what they need to live. And so He's not talking about you have no responsibility whatsoever. What He's saying is God will put opportunities in front of you that allows you to have the daily provisions for life that you need. In the example of the wildflowers, He talks about beauty. That's one way of looking at it. The beauty of the wildflowers comes to them naturally. Why? This is verse 27, or rather verse 28 and following. Why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will He not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? The flowers of the field are beautiful because they were made to be beautiful. And they don't have to toil and spin and worry about looking like something else. They in themselves are beautiful. Now this kind of applies to being loved by others. And we worry a lot about that. And we try to change our looks. And we spend a lot of money. We put forth a lot of effort to try to exercise control over our appearance. And we try to reverse the effects of aging. And eventually, all our efforts fail. We have very little control over that kind of thing. But if we look at what He's saying here, there's a lesson that we are all beautiful in our own way. And we shouldn't be trying to look like somebody else or act like somebody else. But what we should be doing is recognizing the beauty that God has given us and realizing that the inner beauty is more precious than the outer beauty. And God says this in 1 Peter 3 and 4, telling women that the inner person is more beautiful in the sight of God, is more precious in the sight of God than outer appearance. You only have to look at Christ and follow Him, and you already have all that you need to receive God's love, and by extension, the love of His people. You don't have to try so hard. You're like a flower in the field. You, whoever you are naturally beautiful. So it's not about not having responsibilities. It's about God placing opportunities that you can grasp, you can use right in front of you and looking for them on a daily basis. Number two, he's not saying that we should never show concern for things we can change. A lot of people misunderstand Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 and following to say that it's wrong to show any concern whatsoever. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul said there was daily pressure on him because of his anxiety for all the churches. And I don't think he was confessing sin there. I think he was talking about things over which he had some control. And therefore he was working hard, mentally and physically, on behalf of the churches. He had some control there. This is not about worrying over things that you have control. It's about worrying over things you have no control over. There are biblical principles that tell us that we should be concerned about responsibilities that are ours. And so that's not a sin. But we shouldn't fret and worry and be consumed about things outside our control. Look at Psalm 37, verse 8. That reads, "Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil." The English word fret comes from an Old English word that means to devour, to eat, to gnaw in pieces. And the Hebrew word David originally uses in Psalm 37, verse 8, is the word kara, which has at its root the idea of growing warm and blazing up. So put those things together, and he's saying, do not let the rat of worry gnaw you from the inside out. Do not let the fires of anxiety burn you up until there's nothing left. Worry and fretting tends only to evil. But it's the worry and the concern over things outside your control that he's taking aim at here. One last thing. Back in Jesus' words in Matthew 6, he's not saying that we should never plan or save for the future. He's not saying be irresponsible and don't lay aside provisions for the future. What he's saying is don't come to rely on those provisions for your future. Rely on the one who gives you the provisions. It's a very important distinction that we all need to make, because no provision is safe. And we need to realize that. There was a saying in England long ago that no man's property, life, or reputation was safe while Parliament was in session. I've heard people say similar things in the United States. When Congress is about to shut down, I always hear some people say, well, let them shut it down. They're being facetious, and maybe they're not, but they're saying, our property is not safe. And it's true that any day your house could burn down, the economy could fall apart, you could be robbed, you can lose whatever you have. It's foolish to put your faith in the provisions themselves. Put your faith in the one who provides them. And that's where the security is. So focus on what you can do in daily reliance. Number 2, focus on when you can do it. The model prayer is concerned with the present time. Give us this day our daily bread. And later I want you to look at chapter 6, verse 34, where Jesus says, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Take one day at a time. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So be present in what you have in the now. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. And then we have this warning from James 4, 13 and 14. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. How many times have we been reminded of those truths? We really don't need the scriptures on this point to know the truth of this. All of us have woken up one day only to realize that it's not going to go the way that we planned for it to go. And all of us have seen lives cut short when we thought they would go on and on and on. And so just live in the present. As Julie says sometimes, be where your feet are. Don't get carried away and be in another day, because you don't even know if that day will come. So focus on when you can do it. Number 3, focus on why you are doing it. That's another part of daily reliance. Because your life is about so much more than food and clothing and shelter. I go back to verse 25. I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and body more than clothing? Do you want to get to the end of your life only to realize that you just worked for a paycheck? That all your toil, all your efforts, all your energies were just about food and clothing and shelter. Now we have to have those things, and we have to work for those things, but our life doesn't have to be about those things, right? Once our basic needs are met, people aren't unhappy because of a lack of money. They are unhappy because of a lack of meaning. Does your life have any meaning? How can you get meaning in your life? Well, the way you get meaning in your life is by putting first things first. And Jesus says this in verse 33. Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. We worry so much about running out of money, running out of provisions, not having the nicest clothes, not having the nicest car, not having the nicest house. And we forget there are other kinds of death out there. There is a death by bread alone. Do you remember Jesus' temptation in the wilderness? The devil comes to him, and the first temptation is, command these stones that they be made into bread. And do you remember what Jesus said, quoting from Deuteronomy in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4? Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Friends, there is a death by bread alone. You have a soul, and your soul has to be nourished. Don't forget why you're here on earth. It's not to get as much money as you possibly can. You can't take it with you. It's not just to feed your face and put the nicest clothes on your back and build the nicest house up around you, because all of that will one day be gone. And then what will be left? Why do we do what we do? Think about it. What are you investing in? Where are you laying up your treasures? Life has to be about more than bread. During the American labor movement, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a popular song called Bread and Roses. And it was a slogan used by female textile workers at the landmark Lawrence, Massachusetts strike in 1912. And I'm going to read you the first 2 stanzas of this song. As we come marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill-lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses, for the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we come marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. And this is what Jesus was telling Satan in the wilderness. There is a death by bread alone. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Don't allow your soul to suffer starvation while you're worrying about where you're going to get your next meal. So, the fourth point, after we see focus on what you can do, when you can do it, and why you are doing it, the fourth point is let God handle the rest. That's what daily reliance is all about. Letting God handle the things you don't have any control on. Render to God the things that are God's, and to yourself the things that are yours to take care of. In teaching us to pray for daily bread, Jesus is asking us to rely on God's providence. You know, God is active today. He intervenes in our lives. He answers prayer. Everything I read in the Bible tells me that is so. That it's right to believe in that. Now, that's not exactly the same thing as modern day miracles. I think it's important to draw a distinction between divine providence and miraculous activity in the technical sense of the term. Providence is God's non-miraculous activity whereby He uses the laws of nature to accomplish His will. And, I can give you an example of that. You can take childbirth, for example. I often hear childbirth described as a miracle, and I know what people mean when they say that. They mean it's amazing. And in the sense that a miracle is an amazing thing, if you want to use the word that way, fine. But biblically, a miracle is when the laws of nature are broken. It's a supernatural event. And births that we witness today are the result not of miracles, but God's amazing laws of nature working on our behalf. Jesus' birth was a miracle because He was born of a virgin. That's contrary to the laws of nature. So maybe that helps illustrate to you the difference between providence and miracles. God's involved in both. He's doing both things. He's just doing them in different ways. And I want to submit to you this idea that God's providence is no less marvelous than His miraculous activity. C.S. Lewis wrote an essay. I thought I had his quote up there. I don't. C.S. Lewis wrote an essay on miracles in which he said this: "A miracle is a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see." He's always working. Just a miracle brings it down into focus as a reminder. R.C. Trench wrote a textbook on miracles. And he points out that every day God provides wonders according to His natural laws, which is our way of referring to the way He chooses to operate normally in the world. He says, miracles are no more amazing than the gifts God gives us naturally, like the sun, the rain, and the air to breathe, just less frequent. To paraphrase, miracles are no more amazing than your daily bread, just less frequent. When the rain falls, that's God doing an amazing thing. When the sun rises, God is doing amazing things. When the earth circles in orbit, that's God doing something amazing. When some parts of the country will soon be covered with snow, that beauty is God's handiwork. It may not be miraculous, but it's amazing. It's beautiful, inexplicable even. Jesus is telling us to put our confidence in God on a daily basis, which will relieve anxieties about matters beyond our control. In his book, The Divine Conspiracy, Dallas Willard points out that if a mother discovers her child has been hoarding food, that creates a lot of pain and anguish in her soul, because it tells her that he doesn't trust her to do her basic job, which is to make sure that he is fed. And then he makes this point. He says, how do you think God feels when we hoard things up and find security in the things themselves rather than Him? It must grieve His soul terribly to see us afraid to put our trust in Him. Do what you can do, when you can do it. Remember why you are doing it, and let God handle the rest. Don't just do that tonight. Do it day after day after day. And remember to pray, give us this day our daily bread. You know, we say we're saved through faith. What does that mean? What is faith? Faith is trust and reliance. Do you rely on God to save you? If you do, you're going to see His commandments, and you're not going to question them. You're going to obey them. Are you living a life of obedience before Him? Have you obeyed the gospel plan of salvation? Have you believed in Jesus, repented of your sins? Have you confessed His name before men? Have you been baptized for the forgiveness of sins? Do you lead a faithful life of obedience before Him? Maybe there's some changes that you need to make right now before you leave this assembly. Maybe you need prayer. We can pray with you tonight. We can help you do whatever is lacking, but you need to come. Why not come now as we stand together and as we sing?